Chapter 4. Four black-clad, heavily armed men marched through the silent, empty corridors of Zyra Corp's ground floor towards the elevators in the center of the building. With them was a fifth man, younger, African-American, with short curly hair and glasses. Unlike the four men accompanying him, brandishing HK-G36 assault rifles, he was armed only with a laptop and equipped with expensive computer equipment. He shied away from nearest man's weapon, uncomfortable around guns. He had been ever since he'd seen his father shot by that crazy woman 12 years ago. He never liked guns and wasn't particularly fond of being surrounded by armed men, but still he had a job to do and he was damn well going to see it through. The elevator opened as they approached, revealing a fifth armed trooper inside. "The building's clear," he told his companions. "We've got the run of the place." "Where's Weaver?" the young man asked. "She's gone, Mr. Dyson," he replied. "You mean dead?" Danny asked. The armed man, the mercenary team commander whom Danny only knew as Knowles, shook his head. "I mean gone, no trace of her. We swept the building and found nothing." "That leaves the basement," Danny said as he stepped inside the elevator. Two of the four mercenaries followed him inside whilst the other two stood guard. The doors closed and sealed in with the three armed men. His distaste for their weapons increased tenfold as he was closed in a small space with them. He didn't like being stuck with a bunch of ex-Gruntscum soldiers of fortune. His bosses at Kaliba had pulled out all the stops for this operation, and although it might not have been possible without the help of the hired guns, the very sight of the heavily armed men brought back painful memories of his dad being shot. He'd be glad when he could get this job over and done with and get back to living his life again. The elevator finally stopped at the basement level, and as soon as the doors opened, Knowles sprang out into the corridor, assault rifle shouldered. Danny followed up behind him, and the two other men brought up the rear. "End of the corridor, then take a left," Danny instructed them. "That's where the power drain came from." Half of Southern California had lost power suddenly, the infrastructure unable to cope with a sudden and massive power drain that had sucked electricity from the grid like a black hole, and a mass blackout had ensued. His employers, with their vast resources, had been able to trace the source of the blackout to Zyra Corp's basement, accurate to which room it had come from. Whatever had caused it, he had no idea. "Careful," Knowles growled at Dyson and the other two men. "They've got at least one cyborg down here. Where'd they come from?" one of the mercenaries asked. "Ain't ever seen nothing that advanced." Danny didn't say anything. He'd have loved to know the answer to that, too. He had the feeling his employers knew more than they'd let on to him, but that didn't matter right now. All he knew for sure was that Weaver's pet AI was in the basement, the power drain being a telling sign, and it had to be taken care of for all their sakes. They made their way through the basement, their route barely illuminated by emergency lighting. They knew the route to the target room, but the fire team checked every single room along the way, clearing them in case there were any nasty surprises waiting for them. They entered one room, and the first thing all of them noticed was the intense freezing cold that hit them as they stepped inside. Knowles had done several military exercises in Alaska and even the North Pole, and the frigid temperature took him back to the sub-zero blizzards and endless miles of nothing but ice. Knowles and the soldiers were concentrating on the cold, but Danny's attention was elsewhere. The room was huge, and inside it were rows upon rows of server farms that stood taller than any of them. He immediately knew that his employers were right. Zyra Corp were definitely working on an AI similar to the one they were developing. "The cold keeps the server farms from overheating," he explained to them, but it was lost on a trio of former soldiers who knew little to nothing about computers. He knew from this, though, that they were on the right track. The AI he'd helped design had similar server farms kept in cold containment to keep them cool. "It's clear," Knowles growled and eagerly marched the room, keen to get away from the cold. They left the server farms and continued on their way until they arrived at their target destination. The door to the room they wanted was shut. Knowles pulled out a grenade and started to pull the pin as one of the mercs reached for the door handle. "Stun grenades," Danny hissed quietly to them, seeing the small round explosive in the man's hand. "We don't know what's in there," one of the men replied. "Kaliba want the research in this room," Danny whispered harshly to them. "Damn soldiers of fortune." All they cared about was getting their money and blowing things up. "If you go in there all guns blazing, you might damage it." "I'm in charge, kid," Knowles butted in. "We're not getting ourselves killed over some fancy computers." There was a time when he'd have laid down his life for his country, but he wasn't a Marine anymore. He was doing this for the money, pure and simple. Even the $500 a day he was being paid by Kaliba wasn't going to be enough to risk his own life through recklessness. They opened the door, and Knowles tossed the grenade into the room, then stepped back into the corridor and flattened himself against the wall. The grenade exploded with a resounding boom, and a second later Knowles and his two men burst into the room, guns pointed forward as they swept the barrels across, rapidly checking for anything there. 2 seconds after entering the room, Knowles lowered his weapon and let it hang from the sling around his shoulder. "Clear," he called out to Danny. Danny Dyson entered the room and saw it was a complete mess. A table had been shredded by the grenades and computer equipment had been completely shattered. "Look at this," he groaned. Whatever those terminals were for, they weren't going to be doing their job again anytime soon. "That's why I said no grenades. And if there'd been a cyborg in the room, you'd be thanking me over its toasted corpse right now," Knowles barked. "Fucking graduates," he said to himself. "All the book smarts in the world, but they never had a damn clue." "Besides," he added as he looked closer at the shattered computer terminals, "these were shot up before we got here." He saw spent casings on the ground and bent down to pick one up. 9mm. Someone didn't want us to get our hands on whatever this is. Danny saw several more spent casings on the ground and saw that Knowles was right. Someone else had smashed the computers up before they'd arrived. He looked to the bank of advanced computer equipment behind a glass case against the wall. The most prominent one was a black box with 3 red LED lights that formed an inverted triangle, connected to every single other piece of hardware inside the case, with cables that ran behind the wall. A cable ran from the black box, through a hole in the wall underneath the glass display case, and lay in a loose coil on the ground. He had no idea what it could have been attached to. He pulled out the laptop from its case, placed it onto the table next to the glass case, and switched it on. While he waited for the computer to boot up, he turned to Knowles and his men. "This is going to take a while," he told them. "You might as well wait outside." "We're meant to destroy it," Knowles said curtly. Danny barely resisted scowling at the man. "Not before I've taken a look, you don't." Knowles looked at the younger man, rolled his eyes, and led his team out of the room with a grunt of contempt, leaving Danny Dyson alone in the basement room. Danny took several USB cables and other equipment from his bag and placed it next to the laptop. "Time to see what you've got," he spoke to what he assumed was the AI. Danny Dyson was a genius when it came to computers, a young prodigy much like his father had been at his age. He didn't expect it would be long before he opened up the AI as skillfully as a surgeon and learnt all its secrets. John ran through the ruinous streets. His large, heavy boots stomped on the ground with each step he took, too loud for John's liking. His footsteps seemed to echo through the air, and he kept his head on a swivel, petrified that someone or something would hear him. It was night time, and the sky was pitch black, but the darkness didn't make John feel any safer. It simply made him shiver from the drastically freezing winds that battered his body and bit deeply into every inch of exposed flesh. John slowed down to a quick march and kept his hands wrapped around his chest, hugging himself for warmth as he made his way through the dilapidated remains of Los Angeles. He'd never been able to imagine destruction quite like this before. Throughout his life, he'd tried to picture broken buildings and armies of machines patrolling, but seeing the reality was something else entirely. Nothing his mother had taught him could have prepared him for the world he'd emerged into. John Connor had, however, been given the best training his mother could provide, and he knew how to evade enemies. A lifetime of running and hiding from machines trying to kill him had given him a good survival instinct. John kept close to the ruined skeletons of skyscrapers, nervously glancing upwards every now and again, afraid the howling winds would tear something from the giant hulks and send it plummeting down to the ground to flatten him. He looked all around him and kept his eyes wide open, his head swiveled left and right, constantly watching out for any movement. Human or machine. Either could be just as dangerous to John, he realized. He had to assume that anyone or anything other than John Henry or Weaver, wherever the hell they were, was hostile. Where the hell are they, anyway? He wondered. John turned into an alleyway in the middle of a city block. He figured keeping to the narrower passages would lessen the chances of being seen by machines' patrols, at least. It also put some angles between him and the tunnels he'd emerged from and should throw Derek's men off the scent if they survived and decided to chase after him. Knowing his uncle Derek, he would. He doubted this Derek would be that much different. Why had Weaver abandoned him? He wondered. Why had she brought him to the future and just left him to his own devices? He thought long and hard about that as he marched through the city. He started to regret running now as he felt the sweat trickling down his back and neck. It was -0, worse with the wind chill, and the perspiration would soon freeze if he didn't find somewhere to get out of the open air. The high-pitched whine of jet engines shattered the dead quiet and rapidly grew closer. Brilliant white searchlights spilled down from above, striking the ground only a few meters away and approaching. Shit! John ran down the alleyway, his eyes scanning for an entrance into one of the buildings on either side of him. He spotted an open fire doorway, the door itself shattered into shards and splinters a long time ago, and dived through into a crumbling corridor. The search beams swept across and illuminated the ground where he'd just been. John held his breath for a moment, half expecting a plasma bolt or a missile to plow into the building and bring the whole structure crashing down on top of him. John remained statue still in the remains of the corridor. He remembered from his mom's lessons that the machines used infrared to hunt, but he didn't know how powerful those sensors would be. Can it see me inside the building? Had he escaped it, or was it merely vectoring ground troops to his position? He knew so little about this world even after a lifetime of training. John heard the rumbling engines grow faint, and he rushed through the corridor towards the front of the building, seemingly once an office block of some kind, and crouched low behind a large, filthy and dust-covered wooden desk in what had once been the reception area or lobby. John could see out of the wide, shattered doorway and caught a glimpse of the HK as the sleek predator flew away into the distance. He breathed out a sigh of relief. He was safe for now. Not safe, he corrected himself. Never safe, he breathed, but he was out of immediate danger. He figured as long as he stayed inside and kept away from the doors and windows, he'd be okay for the moment. John looked out the doorway once more, scanning the immediate area for any signs of movement. He saw none. Inside the lobby, John saw nothing but strewn litter and detritus on the floor. A cold wind blew through the open entrance and bit into John's skin, causing him to shiver and shudder uncomfortably. Need to start a fire, John muttered to himself, his breath coming out from his mouth in small puffs of steam. John went back behind the desk and ducked down, keeping out of sight of anything or anyone with eyes on the entrance. Not here, he thought to himself. On the ground floor with a wide open door, he might as well put out a flashing neon sign saying, "Here I am. Come get me." John slipped back into the corridor he'd come from and turned left into another hallway, leading to a flight of stairs. He hesitated for a moment at the bottom step, wondering how stable the building would be after a nuclear blast wave and almost 20 years of neglect. I'm about to find out. John strode onto the first step. It held firm under his feet. So far, so good, he thought. He quickly ascended the staircase, keeping close to the walls and not trusting the rusty railing to hold on to. As he got higher, he noticed the brickwork on the floors above him had been shattered, leaving only remnants of concrete that clung onto the twisted steel skeletons like the last scraps of tendon and gristle from a body picked clean by scavengers. John stopped on the first floor, not daring to go any higher. The walls were crumbled and full of holes, but were in better state than those above. He didn't even want to think about what the floors might be like or whether they could even take his weight after all this time. He searched through the first floor and found yet more offices, shattered windows that gaped open, made wider by the walls that had either been blasted away or simply crumbled on their own, or both. Broken computer terminals strewn across the floor in lumps of melted plastic and glass, and desks and chairs that were in varying states of ill repair and decay. John found one room that looked okay. The wall seemed almost intact, with only a few large cracks and the given shattered window. A wooden desk had been split down the middle and had caved in, and best of all, John saw, was a padded leather chair laid out on the floor where it must have been knocked over by the blast wave. He pulled out a greasy old lighter from his jacket pocket and flicked it on, watching the tiny blue flame flickering from the top. John flicked the lid back on and extinguished the flame. He pulled out the knife still stained red with the tunnel rat's blood and jammed it as hard as he could into the side of the broken desk, sinking the blade deep into it and twisting the weapon, splintering the wood. He pulled the knife out and picked out a few splinters and shards and dropped them onto the ground in front of him. He held the knife tight in his hands and started sawing the serrated blade into the wood, going slowly to avoid making too much noise, and started to cut a square into the side of the desk. After a few minutes, he had a vaguely square-shaped section of wood the size of a dinner plate. John scored the blade against the wood repeatedly, cutting lines into it until he could easily snap it into small pieces, and then broke them up further. He could have easily broken it, but he had to assume that there were machines nearby that could hear any noise he made. He needed kindling to start a fire as soon as he could. He'd have to risk the heat signature, but it was worth it. The HK hadn't seen his body heat inside the building, and if he didn't do something, he'd die of hypothermia before dawn arrived. John kept his head down and worked steadily. The countless survival lessons drilled into him in the jungle by his mother slowly started to come back to him. John cut and scored through several more sections of desk and built a small pile on the floor, underneath the other half of the desk. He made a small ring of metal and plaster and concrete around the wooden chunks surrounding the pile. He then took a larger piece of wood and scraped the blade against it, whittling it over the pile so the shavings rained down onto the top. John doubted there'd be any paper nearby. People would have raided the place long ago for anything valuable, so the wood shavings would have to do. By the time he'd finished, John was shaking all over from the cold, and his hands were trembling as he fished the lighter out of his pocket once more. He flicked it on and held the flame over the wood. The wood shavings caught light, and John blew gently, feeding oxygen to the small flame until it caught and started to spread through the wood beneath. John smiled in satisfaction as weak heat started to emanate from the fire and held his hands over the top, taking in the small amount of warmth it generated. Its faint warm glow was dampened by the desk covering it, and John hoped that would shield it from view. He was concerned about the smoke, but the fire was small. He figured he could take the chance. Think warm thoughts, John. He placed another piece of wood onto the fire and grinned in glee as it grew hotter. At this rate, John thought, I might just live to see another day. Two pairs of eyes watched the young man duck into the alleyway to avoid the HK's search beam. They watched him from behind the rusting remains of a flatbed trailer a block down and on the other side of the road. The cab had been blown over by the nuclear blasts, but somehow the trailer was still on all its wheels, flat as the tires were. They knew he would take cover inside one of the buildings, so as soon as the HK lost interest and flew off, they'd made their move and slowly crept around the surrounding area, keeping their eyes focused on the block and watching out for any signs of movement in any of the buildings. They kept low to the ground and moved slowly to avoid being spotted by machines. They'd followed the young man since he emerged from the sewer tunnels, keeping out of his sight but making sure he remained in theirs. They couldn't afford to lose track of him. There, the first one said in a high, feminine voice, pointed up to a faint glow of ambient light on the first floor of a wreck of an office building. The first couple of floors still had concrete surrounding them, having been partially shielded from the blasts by its neighbors, But after that, the individual floors were exposed and open to view for several more stories, before withering into a twisted skeletal tip that listed to one side. Has to be him, right? The second one, a tall, slender black man, looked upwards towards where his companion was pointing. He shouldered his HK-417 battle rifle and peered through the sight. He spotted a faint glow, barely a flicker in the darkness. Yet still, if they could see it, then so could a machine. He must be desperate, he thought. That's him, he commented as he slung his rifle again and looked down to his younger, red-haired companion as she kept her own weapon shouldered, never lowering it for a moment, her finger on the trigger, a bad habit she'd gotten into and simply scoffed at when he pointed it out to her. You sure it's him? She asked, a look of disappointment visible on her face through the darkness and beneath the grime. He doesn't look like much. He looked down at his younger companion and shook his head. What were you expecting, exactly? I don't know, she replied, taking off her black woolly hat to reveal long, grimy hair, unwashed and tangled together in knots from lack of washing and days on end spent out in the field. She scratched her itching hair, then put the hat back on as she continued. Just, more than that, Christ, I could kick his ass without breaking a sweat. I don't doubt that, he replied with a slight smile. Why is he so special? She asked, skepticism in her voice for the umpteenth time. She caught his resigned gaze back at her and knew what he was thinking. They'd been over it 1,000 times before, and he shouldn't have to tell her. But sometimes she just liked to wind him up. She had to get her amusement from somewhere. He better be worth it, is all. He will be, he replied as he swept the area for any signs of machines. He didn't want to make a move towards the building until he knew the coast was completely clear. Others could have eyes on it, too, and however unlikely, he'd learnt a long time ago to expect the unexpected, that things weren't always how they seemed. He had to assume someone else was after him, too. When do we move? She asked, eager and impatient to actually do something. She hated sitting and waiting, especially in this biting cold. She took one end of the scarf wrapped around her neck and pulled it up over her mouth and nose, and with the cold weather goggles she wore, totally obscured her features. A faint, low rumbling echoed from their left and grew louder, soon accompanied by a high-pitched squeaking and cracking sounds. Both of them dropped to the ground and crawled underneath the flatbed trailer, flattening themselves against the ground and staying as still as they could. She cursed quietly as part of the trailer caught her hair and painfully tore several strands out. She wriggled her pack off her shoulders and lay it down on the ground beside her. The rumbling grew louder, and they could hear the sounds of the ground only 100 meters or so away being chewed up by large, heavy tracks. Without looking away from the road in front of her or taking her right hand off her rifle, she rummaged through the pack with her left and found what she was looking for. She pulled out a small tubular periscope and poked the end out from behind one of the wheels. She peered through the lens and saw the mammoth, looming form of a Centaur tank approaching down the road. Massive treads rolled over everything in their path and crushed them. She gulped nervously and wondered if it was going to simply run over the trailer and them. The Centaur was so massive, its tracks took up both lanes of the road, and its twin plasma cannons that hung down from their mounts extended even further. She instinctively gripped the handle of her weapon identical to her companion's and pulled it towards her. Don't! He clamped his hand down over her rifle and pinned it to the ground. He knew how she got sometimes when the machines were around. She was often too eager for a fight. The center tank rumbled past them, the tracks so close that the armored panels guarding the top halves scraped against the side of the flatbed and sent a shower of sparks cascading down in front of them. Both rapidly backed away to the opposite side, careful to remain under cover. It passed by them without incident, and she once again used her periscope to peek out and watch the behemoth machine as it rolled down the street and away from them. It hadn't fired any shots at either them or the office building opposite, and the faint glow had disappeared from view, leaving the building completely dark once more. We don't move yet, he finally answered when the Centaur had turned left onto another road and disappeared from view. Wait until the coast is clear. She nodded in reply and clutched her rifle in both her hands. Where centaurs patrolled, endos were normally close by. Sometimes they followed up after the centaurs, sweeping the area for anything they might have missed. They'd seen it before. Or after the centaurs were gone, people would come out on their own afterwards, thinking the coast was clear straight into the endos. The pair of them rolled under the trailer so she was facing the tail end, and he lay at a right angle to her, looking out at the building where their target had taken shelter. Watching it, as well as keeping an eye out for any machines that followed up the center tank. They lay in absolute silence and kept vigilant watch over a 180 degrees angle, keeping watch of both the target and the most likely approach any following patrol would come from. Both kept their eyes wide open and listened out. There was no sound at all, no signs of even the slightest traces of life. They both knew they could be there for hours, and neither one expressed the apprehension they both felt at the thought of what might happen if the machines got to them, or their target moved away from them before the area was clear. "You okay there, old man?" She broke the silence with a soft whisper, gently nudging his leg with her boot as she held out her weapon and scanned for any movement coming towards them. "I'm fine." In truth, he wasn't fine, not at all. He was afraid, though he had been for 18 years now. It was more than that, though. He wasn't so much afraid for himself anymore. Most of his concern had been for her, but now even his paternal instincts for his young companion were overshadowed. Only John Connor mattered now. Finding him was everything. John Henry marched through the city as Inkai blackness slowly faded away into a murky purple-grayish dawn on the horizon, with a hint of blood red seeping through. The coloring of the dawn was strange to him. He'd never seen dawn himself before, but he'd seen hundreds of thousands of images online of the sun rising, and none of it looked like this. It was an unusual atmospheric phenomenon, and he was intrigued by it. Cameron wasn't so keen to see the sun rising, focused on them arriving at their destinations safely so they could help John. "We should find somewhere to hide until dark. HKs hunt better during daylight." John Henry was aware that Cameron was analyzing everything he saw for suitable hiding places, though he didn't understand the need to do so. Why would they attack another machine? He'd assumed that other machines would identify them as a Terminator, and therefore an allied unit. We look human. HKs and centaurs can't tell the difference, and Terminators don't patrol out in the open during the day because humans don't, Cameron said. John Henry had access to the memories she chose to share with him, and took a millisecond to sift through those she offered of all the times she'd seen any humans out in the open. None were in the daytime. He accessed her memories on the technical specs of the HKs and Centaur tanks, and absorbed the information she gave up to him like a sponge. Their vast array of high-tech sensors equipped the air and ground patrol machines to spot and hunt humans very efficiently, and he knew instantly that humans' highest chances of survival would be after dark. Cameron was right. They continued east through the giant ruins of Los Angeles, having marched for days without stop, other than to evade the machines and hide in the ruins during the daytime. One of the advantages of being a cyborg was that they didn't need rest or nourishment and could continue almost indefinitely. The massive dead hulks of skyscrapers started to thin out as they approached the outskirts of the city, and eventually disappeared completely, replaced by smaller and smaller buildings. Eventually, they reached what had once been a high school. Most of the building was much like the rest of the city skeletons of steel girders and piles of broken concrete haphazardly strewn across the ground. One difference both AIs noticed immediately was a pair of humans sat atop cracked steps that led up to the frame of what had once been the school's main entrance. The two humans were dressed in camouflage military jackets, blue and black trousers respectively, and both wore beige desert boots. Both held weapons, and through John Henry's eyes, Cameron immediately identified them as a Mossberg 590 and an M14 with a scope. They're not much of a threat on their own, but they could have friends, Cameron told him. "Hey!" one of them shouted out to them. The two humans jumped down the steps and approached them, weapons held firmly in their hands. "What the hell are you doing out here?" Machines are gonna see you, dumbass. John Henry turned towards them and smiled as they got closer. Hello! He held out his open right hand towards them, a gesture of greeting he'd seen many times when perusing files on human social interaction. Don't be a freak. What are you, stupid? Waltzing out on your own when the sun's about to come up. Tin cans will catch you in a flash, the man wielding the M14 said to him. Tin cans? John Henry asked. Tin cans, machines. You've been living in a cave these past 18 years, the second man said. He turned to his accomplice. This guy's a couple cans short of a six-pack, he muttered. He'd seen plenty like this guy before. They weren't all there in the head, for one of a number of reasons. Trauma, stress, hunger, or maybe the guy was just plain dense. Still, the sun would be up soon, and with it the danger from the machines increased dramatically. You're here now, might as well come in. He beckoned John Henry inside and disappeared inside the remains of the building. The second man went inside, and John Henry followed. Cameron remained silent inside the chip, allowing John Henry to walk through the door. Inside, the two men led him down the main corridor. Tiled floors were now bare gray concrete, and lockers still lined the walls, but many were missing their doors, pried or blasted open. None of the doors to the classrooms were still there, and the outside walls were shattered and left the rooms exposed to full view. They led John Henry towards a staircase, and they descended below ground level into a basement. Down below, the damage was much less extensive, he noticed, but had still given way to time and decay. Through another hallway and into a small room they went. What its previous use before Judgment Day had been, neither John Henry nor Cameron could tell. At one end was a blackboard, torn and ragged but still up against the wall, but the rest of the room had been completely gutted. A few occupants huddled around an improvised campfire in the middle of the room. Two women, a single little girl that both AIs estimated between 10 and 12 years old, and the two men. All were filthy, unwashed, and had thin faces. Their eyes opened wide at the sight of the newcomer accompanying the two men. Sit, one of them gestured to a spot on the floor, around the fire. John Henry accepted the invitation and sat down next to the little girl. He smiled at her, but she shied away and shuffled to her left, into her mother's arms. John Henry's smile faded in disappointment. Savannah had never shied away from him, and he'd acted just as he had with her. We should go. John Henry ignored Cameron's warning. He was intrigued to see more of how people lived in this time. From what he'd seen so far, it wasn't very pleasant. Well, the man who invited John Henry to sit started. I'm Rick, and this is Tony, he pointed to the other man. The two ladies are Kelly, that's my wife, cutting the chunks of meat up, and Jessica. The little one is Tony and Jessica's daughter, Grace. Where'd you come from? Tony asked as he took off his woolly hat and scarf and sat opposite John Henry, on the other side of the fire. One of the women placed a grill over the fire with small chunks of meat on, which instantly started to sizzle as the flames gently seared them. San Diego, Cameron answered with John Henry's voice, randomly selecting a location in California that wasn't nearby so they couldn't ask him any trick questions to catch him out. San Diego, Jessica asked as she held Grace under one arm and gently stroked the dirty curls of blonde hair. Why come all the way from there? Kinda dangerous, isn't it? Rick commented as he poured some water from a canteen into a dirty metal saucepan and put it on the grill next to the pieces of meat, which had already started to brown slightly on the bottom. Why'd you risk your ass coming all the way here from San Diego? John Connor, Cameron prompted John Henry. She wanted to know what had happened to him, where they could find him, and what the state of the resistance was. John Connor, he replied, taking Cameron's lead. We came to find him. Do you know where he is? Who? Tony looked at him, bewildered. I never heard of him, sorry. Tony looked around at the others, but they all shook their heads. Cameron was confused. How had they not heard of John Connor? Had something happened to John? Was he alive? Had he survived Judgment Day? Cameron suddenly thought that leaving John to take John Henry to the future might not have been a good idea. She'd done it to protect him, not able to trust herself anymore, deciding that John Henry was a more valuable ally, and that the machine imitating Catherine Weaver, and James Ellison would help Sarah protect John in the meantime. Weaver had resources at her disposal. She could hide John and Sarah somewhere safe. She'd brought John Henry to the future to give John a powerful ally and a greater chance of beating Skynet, but it seemed to have backfired. Who's leading the resistance? John Henry asked, knowing Cameron's concern for her former charge. I don't know you heard in San Diego, buddy. Rick laughed bitterly. But there ain't no resistance. Nobody fights back against Skynet and lasts very long. Did anyone ever fight back? John Henry asked. Dude, where have you been these past 18 years? John Henry hesitated for a nanosecond, not long enough for the humans to notice, and Cameron took over and answered for him. Hiding, she said. Out at sea on an oil rig. We abandoned it after a storm. We landed in San Diego and hid. Goddamn machines picked us off one by one. We'd heard of a John Connor fighting against the machines, wanted to check it out, figured we'd be safer with him. John Henry was impressed at her lie and how well she'd told it. She'd sounded almost human. One of John's senior officers worked on an oil rig before the war, she explained. She'd simply repeated the story he'd told in the tunnels. Seriously, you were out at sea all this time. Jessica commented, unsure whether or not to believe them. How'd you live out there? We got by, Cameron replied. John Henry didn't try to wrestle her for control. She was better at lying than he was, even though he could fully control his body's reflexes and expressions. Cameron was better at lying on the spot. John Henry had never had to lie before, except between Mr. Ellison and MTS Weaver. North Pacific cod and haddock nuclear winter made them all swim south, the seas full of them. Cameron knew John's value of human life and could sense John Henry shared similar values, and she decided this family could benefit from the knowledge of an abundant supply of food in the coastal waters nearby. If you were at sea so much, you probably never even heard half of what was going on here, Tony commented. I haven't heard of any Connor, but since the regular army got their asses kicked, there hasn't been much of any kind of resistance, except once. Why? John Henry asked, resuming control once more. Why would humans allow themselves to be killed in such numbers? He'd researched human history and found them to be extremely resourceful. He found it strange that nobody had attempted to fight back. I'd fight, he added. If he'd known his brother would cause so much death and destruction, he would have tried to prevent it. He'd have fought against his brother. You not heard of Martin Bedell? Rick raised an eyebrow, starting to wonder about John Henry. How could a guy even one at sea, if that were even true, know about all this? Didn't they have radios or something at sea? Cameron had heard of him. She remembered future John telling her about Martin Bedell, but she told John Henry to deny any knowledge of him. If nobody had heard of John, then perhaps Martin Bedell would be a link to him. John Henry shook his head. He fought back, Tony said. Took the remnants of the military, willing civvies, and started a guerrilla war against the machines, setting traps, ambushes, blowing them up, and so on. For a while it worked. He blew the machines away and drew more and more people to his cause with every raid. Some of us even thought he'd actually do it for a while. What happened? John Henry asked. Rick looked at him in reply, a sad, wistful look in his eyes as he remembered back to that fateful day. Skynet set a trap. Rick crouched down low behind the rusting remains of an upside-down SUV. His squad mates, Tony, Roy, Big Dave, so large and powerfully built that people who didn't know him often thought he was a T-800. And Tommy, the youngest member of their squad at only 16. Were all next to him, as was their commander, Martin Bedell. They were all hidden on what was left of a raised section of the highway, waiting in ambush for their target. Other squads were nearby, concealed and waiting for it to all kick off. Listen up, guys. Bedell spoke to Rick's squad and the other squads simultaneously via his radio. The prison convoy to Century's gonna be here any minute. Intel says it's 4 monkey wagons, protected by 3 centaurs, an ogre, an HK, and probably at least a dozen endos riding shotgun. Bedell kept his eyes on the highway as he spoke, searching for any signs of the convoy, though he had lookouts posted who'd tell him when it approached. We're here to rescue a high-level prisoner, so be careful what you shoot at. Rick was still unsure of the operation, despite the briefings they'd had. Bedell had led them well the past 3 years, built up an effective guerrilla movement, and they'd taken the fight back to the machines. But this was a little too high risk for his liking. Bedell had mobilized over 100 men for this mission, just to rescue one man. Bedell said this guy was important, someone who could help them not only fight the war but win it. "All squads in position?" Bedell asked. He got back a chorus of affirmatives from his various squad leaders. He had the best his resistance had with him, 100 strong. They should outnumber the machines vastly, and they were heavily armed enough to make short work of the centaurs before they could cause too much trouble. He even had teams armed with shoulder-launched SAMs and anti-tank missiles. It had to work. He'd gotten the intel from a double agent posing as a Grey working for Skynet. The man had risked everything to get him the information. A prisoner of great importance, someone the machines considered valuable enough to warrant such a massive security detail. It had to be Connor, surely. As soon as he'd heard, he'd pulled his best troops away from other missions and put everything he had into this operation. Connor had saved his life once. He'd return the favor, find out what the fuck Connor had been doing this whole time, and then between them, they might be able to actually win this war once and for all. Reese to Bedell, his earpiece crackled. "Target acquired, 3 monkey wagons plus escorts approaching your position. Eat a 5 minutes. "Good job, Reese," he replied. "Let them pass. Do not engage." Reese was leading the 3 squads of the left cutoff group, who'd close the gap after the machines had passed and complete a pincer movement, as would the right cutoff group if they were needed. Time slowed down to a crawl as they waited for their quarry to arrive. The worst part about combat, they reflected, was the waiting. 5 minutes seemed to take an eternity, and it gave Rick plenty of time to think about what could go wrong. Eventually, the convoy arrived. 2 behemoth centaur tanks blazed a trail, followed by the prisoner transports. The ogre, carrying the endos no doubt, rode along to the side of the caravan, and the final centaur covered their rear. A single HK flew slowly overhead, scanning the area for threats. Targer HKs first, centaurs second. Bedell whispered into his radio. Stand by! Stand by! Go!" Rockets and plasma fire erupted from scores of locations and lit night into day, turning the silent night air into a storm of flying lead and plasma. The HK was struck by 3 rockets at once and blew apart in a flash of orange and blue light as the superheated plasma on board ignited and vaporized most of the aircraft. More rockets struck the centaurs, exploding brilliantly and tearing through their densely armored hides. They fired back and struck a number of soldiers, but there were so many of them that the 3 machines were quickly neutralized. The ogre wasn't spared, either, and grenades, rockets, machine gun, and plasma fire tore through its walls, silencing its automated plasma cannon and shredding the endos inside. 30 seconds into the engagement, all the machines had fallen. "Cease firing." Bedell shouted, the storm of weapons fire halting a moment later. He got up to his feet and advanced towards the monkey wagons. "Rick, Jonas, Ramirez, Goines, bring your squads to me. Everyone else cover us." 30 men spread out and rushed across the wide stretch of road towards the convoy, covered by the rest of the group. Bedell felt a rush of exhilaration. They'd pulled it off so far without a hitch. He saw the prisoners inside the transports, stood and sat down, peering outside, their clothes ragged and their faces dirty. They all had blank, empty stares. "Blast the locks," Bedell ordered. Gunshots rang out as the doors were blown apart, then pulled open. Bedell stood outside one of the transports and beckoned the prisoners out. "It's okay now, you're safe. Connor, where are you?" The prisoners rushed out of the transport, much faster than he'd ever seen men move, and Bedell's elation turned to shock and terror as one of them pulled a plasma rifle from beneath his ragged clothes and pointed it straight at him. "It's a trap." He managed to shout out a split second before the prisoner fired once, and Bedell's head exploded in a mess of charred flesh and a red cloud of boiled blood. His lifeless body dropped to the ground. In a flash, every single prisoner whipped out identical plasma rifles and opened up on their would-be rescuers, hosing them down in a murderous hail of luminous, superheated gas and cutting them down in SWAT. "Fuck!" Rick shouted as he fired his plasma rifle back at the machines. They were goddamn Terminators, all of them. Plasma rounds, rockets and bullets zipped through the air at the machines, but their returning salvos were devastating. They leapt out of the wagons and fanned out rapidly before they could be contained, blasting anything that moved. Someone shouted orders, but nobody was listening. Blind panic had taken over in an instant. "We're fucked." Roy shouted out, going manic with fear as he ran for his life back to the cover of the SUV. A plasma bolt struck his chest and boiled his organs inside him, leaving a gaping, blackened hole in his torso the size of a dinner plate. The scene around them became one of panic and hysteria as the machines cut through the human ranks without effort. Some were downed, but 40 machines against 100 men equaled no contest. They didn't stand a chance. Rick led his squad to the left, hoping to link up with the teams from the left cut-off group, who should be approaching any moment. A group of 8 machines moved to block off their path and fired salvos of plasma fire, forcing them back towards the center of the kill zone Bedell had established, and he realized the machines were using their own tactics against them and had deployed cut-off groups to ensure nobody escaped. "They're boxing us in." Big Dave shouted out as he hefted his machine gun and hammered a tin can from the cut-off group with 7.62 mm rounds. The inertia of his burst knocked the machine back on its ass, but a second one picked up the slack and continued firing in its place, forcing him to duck down. Plasma fire shot over his head, and the sheer heat from the bolts singed his hair and scalp. He winced in pain, but his adrenaline was up, so it was minimal, for now at least. Tony kept low to the ground and pressed the comm button on his radio. "Reese, Mitchell, where the hell are you guys? We need some goddamn fire support to the east right now." "Mitchell's dead," Reese's reply came through his earpiece. "Tin cans took out his whole squad. HKs are en route. It's too hot here. We're bugging out while we can. Get the fuck back here and help us." Tony raged into the radio futilely. It was too late. Reese and his squad were retreating. They never answered the radio again. He looked towards Rick and shook his head. "Reese has split. We're on our own. Over the edge, it's our only chance." Rick shouted to the rest of his squad and pointed to the edge of the highway. He knew there was no hope now. They couldn't survive this. Anyone who stayed was a dead man, and the machines didn't seem to want to let any of them go. They were fanning out and flanking them, surrounding them. He shot one machine in the head, but didn't wait to see it fall before he ran towards the concrete wall built to keep cars from driving over the side and crashing to the road below. Tony, Big Dave, and Tommy all followed him through the din and the chaos. All around them, soldiers fired and ran and fell whilst machines hosed people down without mercy. They'd advanced outwards and surrounded them on 2 sides and were now working their way inwards in a pincer movement, forcing the remaining soldiers into one spot to dispatch of them. The only way out was over the side of the highway. Tommy and Big Dave lay prone on the ground and fired towards the convoy as Rick and Tony secured ropes from their packs around the metal railings at the top. "Let's go," Rick shouted out. He took one look at the battle scene and saw the outgoing fire towards the convoy had whittled down to almost nothing. Fire support teams had been slaughtered or had abandoned their positions, only a few still putting rounds down, ineffectively, into the machines. A few metal monsters fell, but there were far too many to overcome. Plasma fire struck Tommy, and he fell as Rick and Tony climbed over the edge and started to lower themselves down the ropes. Big Dave saw a pair of machines approaching him, their skins burnt and tore by weapons fire, but they were unaffected by it. Their weapons were raised, and he knew he'd never make it to the ropes. Running would just get him shot in the back. "Go!" he shouted out to them as he held down the trigger on his gun and blasted a stream of hot lead into the machines. He screamed out in rage until both machines calmly pointed their rifles at him and fired. 2 bolts of plasma struck Big Dave and blew him apart in an explosion of gaseous, boiled blood and burnt flesh and bone fragments that flew in all directions, peppering Rick and Tony below with pieces of his charred remains. The two of them fast-roped down to the highway beneath, practically in freefall for the last few feet, then ran as fast and as hard as they could, desperate to get away. Rick looked back at the scene above they'd just fled. HKs flew in low and fast and hosed the battleground above with plasma fire, obliterating the entire kill zone in massive clouds of fire and wiping out the remaining survivors of Bedell's attack force above them. He shook his head in dismay and carried on running. This battle was over. The only thing left now was to survive. After that, Bedell's resistance just fell apart, Tony added as Jessica poured the boiling water from the saucepan into some mugs, added some coffee from a couple of tattered sachets, and handed one steaming cup to John Henry. Tony continued. We got back to base, got the girls here, and went into hiding. Checked on the base the next day, but Skynet got to them. Nothing left. We heard some others managed to get away, but we never heard from any of them ever again. Everyone just kinda gave up and went their separate ways. Inside John Henry's chip, Cameron was shocked at this new revelation. The resistance had fallen apart because John wasn't there to lead it. But why wasn't he there? Something must have happened to him. She wanted to know what. John Henry was curious too. He wanted to know why John Connor seemed uniquely capable of leading a war against Skynet, and why Cameron had such reverence for him. He only had access to her thoughts and memories if she chose to share them, but from what she'd communicated to him so far, he could tell she held him in very high regard. He pulled the cup to his lips and drank the whole thing down in one mouthful, analyzing the boiling liquid as it flowed down his throat and scalded the flesh. That coffee was 30 seconds off the boil. Jessica raised her eyebrows suspiciously at him and hugged Grace closer to her. Nobody could just down it like that. The drink she'd given him was scalding hot. Tony and Rick both shot up and pointed their weapons at John Henry. You're a machine, Rick snarled. John Henry looked at the two men and smiled, trying his best to look friendly. I'm not going to hurt you. Rick fired a shot into John Henry's kneecap. The round tore through his skin but bounced harmlessly off the hyperalloy beneath it. The two humans saw how he was completely unaffected, and that was enough to confirm what they already suspected. They opened up with their weapons and loosed a deafening salvo of fire at John Henry, shredding his clothes and skin as Jessica covered Grace's ears from the roaring reports that reverberated round the small room. Cameron forced her way back in control of the body and moved forward even as the bullets tore through their flesh and flattened against the endoskeleton underneath. She quickly identified the most effective places to strike the humans and stepped towards Tony as she drew John Henry's fist back. Silver liquid dropped from the ceiling between Cameron/John Henry and the two armed humans, stopping them in their tracks as the puddle of chrome rose up and took shape, slowly transforming into a gleaming silver humanoid form. Cameron/John Henry also stopped, surprised at the shining liquid metal in front of her. Monochrome silver changed colors and took on skin tones and textures. Smooth contours ruffled and formed into clothing, and the silver creature transformed into a red-haired woman in an expensively tailored business suit, a look of disdain on her face. That's my boy you're shooting. Weaver shook her head at the two humans, the faintest trace of annoyance visible on her features. What the fuck? Tony stared in shock at the impossible thing in front of him. What the hell was it? He pointed his shotgun at Weaver, but she was too fast. She shot out one arm in a flash, her hand slimmed down into a razor-sharp point and impaled Tony through the chest, cleaving his heart clean in two inside his ribcage. Tony coughed once and his legs buckled beneath him. Weaver pulled back her blade and he dropped dead to the ground. Grace cried out in fear and hugged her mother tightly, and the rest of them stared in horror at Weaver and her blood-stained appendage. Her other hand changed into a second blade, and with an ice-cold, merciless glare in her eyes, she advanced towards the remaining humans.